Welcome to episode number 2, where we were wrong. There's new evidence now revealing that women need to eat and train differently than men in order to optimize their results. This is the Feminine Strength Podcast, where we share innovative strategies for women to build a strong, fit body in a sustainable way while supporting their hormonal health and their nervous system resilience. I'm your host, Jess Mather. I'm a strength and rehab professional with over 14 years of experience working with clients all around the world to help them feel happier, healthier, and stronger in their body. So you might have heard me say this before in some of my content if you've been following me for some time, that one of the worst things I've ever done for my health was to actually eat and train like a man. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. And hopefully as I go through some of these interventions that I tried, which we'll call male-oriented protocols, you might be able to see if you've tried these protocols before and were left wondering why they didn't work well for you either, or maybe they worked temporarily and then they stopped working. So we're going to look at these male-oriented protocols first, and then we're going to cover how we can use more female-oriented protocols instead to maximize our results and our health. So what do I mean by male-oriented protocols? So historically, research and studies on fitness and nutrition have been done on men. So when we start to apply them to women, when we're very different, and we'll go over what all those differences are today, then we start to see some breakdown in the results. So while these protocols can work well in the short term for women, we might see some results from them, they work better for men long term, these male-oriented protocols that we'll cover. So fortunately now we have more evidence, we have more experience to implement better interventions specifically for women, which we will cover towards the end of this episode. So personally, I have been weightlifting for over 15 years. I love lifting weights. I've worked in the strength and rehab industry for 14 years, over 14 years at this point, which feels crazy. So what I've been doing the last 14, 15 years has been following what was being presented at these big fitness conferences that I'm going to, what I've learned from my mentors, from my colleagues. We're always in conversation about what the science is saying, what's coming out, what's working. I would follow a lot of work on evolutionary science when it came to the strength and rehab world, developmental movement patterns. So essentially, I was more in the area where I like to see what is the most natural and correct for our biology as a human species. I wasn't really looking at the female and male differences. It wasn't really talked about, it wasn't something that was a conversation. I was just looking at it makes the most sense to me to eat and train in a way that's most aligned with how we've developed as a species. So I went deeper into the paleo diet, which many of you have heard before, more of like a ancestral diet. The co-founder of Whole30 of the paleo diet, Dallas Hartwig, was actually my physical therapist. I stupidly ran my bicycle into a mailbox. I was 18 and I had to go get physical therapy on my shoulder, and he happened to be my therapist in this little rehab clinic in Brunswick, Maine. And he influenced me actually to go into this field. So the beginnings of my learning in this world was actually from evolutionary science and ancestral nutrition. So that's the line that I was going through, but most of my mentors and teachers, even so, that I was following in the fitness and nutrition world were men. And I had never questioned or considered that me in a female body might need something different, might need something to be adapted because of my hormones, because of even just my menstrual cycle. It never really crossed my mind. And ultimately, that was even seen as weak. It was seen as less than, we have to make modifications because we're women. I was told at these lectures that women were not much different than men, that we didn't have to do anything different. We're still hearing that narrative today. We didn't need to train or eat differently. And women didn't want to be seen as different. A lot of women still don't want to be seen as different. They want to say, I can do everything a man can do, or as the phrase goes, I can do everything a man can do, but I can do it better while bleeding. And perhaps, but at what cost? So we are biologically different. We do function differently on many different levels, and it goes beyond just the fact that we have menstrual cycles and men don't. It doesn't mean that we're less than or that we're weaker than men. It just means that we have to do things differently, and that how things were usually taught before were based on male research or male oriented protocols. So now we get to see that we can do things in a more female oriented way, in a way that really supports us as a human being still, but also our unique biological differences. So, more of the male oriented protocols would be things like prolonged fasting, which was very, very popular, especially in the ancestral world of evolutionary science and going into the nutrition piece, was these long fasts, or we call them the warrior diet. I remember reading a lot on the warrior diet and thinking that sounded so cool. I want to fast for 20 hours a day and just eat a big meal at the end of the day. Many men can tolerate this very well. I did it once with a friend at the time, a male friend, and we fasted 24 hours. It was miserable. And then we ate a big 16-ounce steak each and whiskey on the rocks. And that was an exhausting day. That was a very memorable, exhausting day, actually, for both of us. So these prolonged fasts, men can typically handle much better than women can. We also see that a more male-oriented protocol are linear weightlifting programs. We have more dips in energy throughout the month. We have cramping throughout the month. We have different biological shifts that happen that don't allow us to work at such a linear way that men can perform in a more linear way. So these weightlifting programs that don't accommodate for our natural fluctuations throughout the month, those we would consider more of a male-oriented protocol. We also see that men can tolerate prolonged and deep calorie restriction. So that's a big conversation, is dieting for women. We'll talk about calorie restriction here today and fat loss from a healthy way for women. But we do not adapt as well to prolonged or aggressive calorie restriction that men do. Another example of a male-oriented protocol would be ice baths, which I have personally done, and we're going to cover that as well, of how that is actually more of a male-oriented protocol, and that there are ways that we can still get the benefits of an ice bath without having to sit into a bath of ice cubes. So I'm going to cover 7 main areas of differences between men and women, and how we can make some little shifts in the way that we're treating our bodies and eating and training in order to optimize our results. So we're going to look at differences in fat loss and calorie restriction, differences in fasting and meal timing, what works better for men versus women. We're going to look at differences in our nutritional needs, in temperature regulation, sleep and recovery needs, which is so important, different weight training protocols that are more female oriented, and also our exercise selection. Doesn't matter what exercises we're selecting if we're a woman versus a man. So those are the things we're going to cover. Before we hop deeper into this episode, remember that I drop off a secret word in every episode at some point. You won't know when it's coming. If you collect 8 of these secret words, these kind of random secret words, we give you 10% off our signature feminine strength training program. All you have to do is listen for the word, jot it down, keep it somewhere safe, and then reach out once you collect 8, okay? So when it comes to the differences between men and women, it's not just our menstrual cycle that makes us different. There are a wide array of changes that happen when we're developing as little babies before we're even in this world. It's a combination of factors. And interestingly, though, we are mostly like men, or we're mostly alike when we're children, because we haven't hit puberty yet, right? That is a huge transition that happens as a human. So boys and girls who haven't gone through puberty yet, we see that there are a lot more similarities in how they move, their capacity for exercise. And then we do see after puberty things can change more dramatically, or they really do change more dramatically. There's a statistic I learned that over 60% of girls over the age of 14, over 60% of girls over the age of 14 drop out of sports because they're not comfortable with the changes in their body. More than half of girls stop being athletic and stop doing the things they enjoy because they don't understand the changes going on in their body. So the relationship between their hips and their knees change because their hips get wider. Their center of gravity starts to change, so movement is going to feel a lot different. Their fat distribution changes, obviously. Then we have the whole conversation about bras and boobs when we go through puberty. So girls are actually dropping out of athletic endeavors much earlier because of these changes, and that's really unfortunate. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case you have girls in your life or you have young daughters, is to you know create some sort of, hopefully, environment where you can talk about these things and make them feel comfortable, because it is a really real thing that girls will start to feel uncomfortable as their body goes through these changes. They're not performing in the same way as their male counterparts anymore. And just even having this information for them can be really, really helpful. So let's cover this first pillar of differences here, our fat loss and calorie restriction. So when it comes to fat loss and calorie restriction, in general, we have different minimum body fat requirements, men versus women. So men require at least 4 to 8% of body fat in order to function, and that's very, very low. Okay, 4 to 8% for men. Women require a minimum of at least 12%, and that's what we would consider stage ready. So those are women who are going and competing. It's very, very lean. They're usually doing drastic changes to their carbohydrates and their water intake in order to really make sure they look lean and get a really, really lean body fat. On a day-to-day basis, men can reasonably sit around 15% body fat, so they still need more body fat to function than their 4 to 8%. 15% is still very lean. And women can maintain their body fat around 18 to 20%, sometimes a little bit lower depending on their age and their training and nutrition history and their genetics, but typically around 18 to 20%. If you're a woman maintaining around 18 to 20%, this would generally mean that you're training several days a week, you're walking regularly or doing some sort of movement, and you're being mindful of your nutrition. You're making sure you're getting enough protein, and you're making sure you're watching usually your sugar intake. You're not eating a lot of sweets. For the most part, you're eating well. So women can maintain around 18 to 20%. Men can maintain around 15%. We are biologically designed as women, obviously, to preserve more fat for reproductive purposes. So we need that extra bit of fat. With that said, calorie restriction then is more threatening to our system. It is more of a threat response to our brain and to our nervous system of, oh, there's a decrease in calories coming in, because it is so much more imperative for us to have that body fat on us. So men as a whole are generally less sensitive to caloric changes. For women, if we're in prolonged deficits for long periods of time, we can see an increase in cortisol and a downregulation in thyroid function. This happened to me and it sucked. I would not recommend it on anybody. And what was interesting and unfortunate was that I didn't even know that I was under eating. I thought because I was a petite female, I only needed around 1,400, 1,500 calories, even though I was training regularly, I was moving very often, I was riding my bike, I was on my feet all day at a busy physical therapy clinic. I didn't even realize, because the narrative was women aren't supposed to eat that much, and it did real damage to my body for a long time. So we really want to be careful that we're eating enough food. So what I have my female clients do is I have them track their food for at least 5 days, their normal baseline of what they're eating, just to see what's going on really under the hood. We often think we're either eating more or eating less than we really are. It's unusual that we actually know and have a good intuitive sense of how much we're eating. Once we track it, then we have that data. So I always ask my female clients, just track your food, your normal eating, as normal as you can get it. Measure what you're eating. Don't just eyeball a tablespoon. Measure it so we really have an accurate representation of how much you're eating. Once we have an accurate representation and we know you're eating enough, then we put clients in a deficit if they want to lose fat, somewhere around 10 to 20% of their maintenance calories, which is how much it would be if we average those 5 days up. So we would do about a 10 to 20% deficit, depending on how much weight they have to lose, their current weight, how aggressive they want to be, all sorts of other factors. But generally, that's the range that we go to. So again, I used to maintain my weight around 1,400, 1,500 calories a day. I was actually under eating and I didn't know. When I was exercising all the time, I just thought that was what it was supposed to be. For comparison, I eat now closer to 2,400 calories a day. I train less, I move much less, and I actually weigh less as well. And I am not an unusual statistic. I have worked with other clients as well where they actually weigh less, they're doing less, but they're eating more. Usually what that would mean is we'd have to put women through a refeeding process. I've never had to do a refeed for a man. We'll just throw that out there. Because usually women were conditioned or were pressured to do these prolonged diets, and it's just not helpful for our hormones and our metabolism, and then we have to build things back up. And then we can eat a lot and things are good and it's much more easy to maintain a low body fat, but we don't do it by being in a chronic deficit. It was a huge misconception that I learned, is just being in a chronic deficit in order to stay a lower weight. It's just not what we need to do at all. It's not healthy and sustainable. So, next piece here, which branches off of calorie restriction and fat loss, is fasting and meal timing. Again, fasting was very popular at least 10 years ago. It's really, I feel like, when it came out strong. I was doing intermittent fasting. I was following this man. He was a personal trainer. I believe his website was called something like Lean Gains, if you've heard of that. Lean Gains. It must have been over 10 years ago at this point. And he was a huge advocate for a 16-hour fast and an 8-hour feed window. 16-8 was the phrase that it was called. 16-8, 16-8 fast. And he would post on his blog really elaborate studies and research. And I thought it was fascinating, and I read all these sorts of research articles about the 16-8 fast, and so I thought, oh, this sounds great. This sounds like a great way to maintain low body fat, and it's simple and it's straightforward. I can use this with my clients. Well, that was not good for me. I was essentially forcing myself to fast. I was putting off breakfast in the morning. And then later more research comes out, oh, women are actually supposed to fast much less. So a window of a 14-10 fast feed window is more appropriate for women if they feel like fasting is something that works for them. So 14-hour fast in a 10-hour feeding window, so they're not fasting as long. So like we talked about earlier with the warrior diet, which is more closer to a 18 to 20-hour fast, women don't do well with these prolonged fasts. It's too much for our system because of our sensitivity to fluctuations in calorie intake. It's also really hard to get our calories all in a small window. So consider if you had to eat all your calories in 4 hours, especially if you're trying to make sure you're eating enough, if you've been already chronically under eating, and then you're doing these long fasts, and then you're trying to stuff in all your food in a small window, it's just not gonna work. So for me, if I had to eat 2,400 calories in 4 hours, I would feel awful. I think my stomach would tell me, no, you are not eating that amount of food, right? So for women, usually we don't want to eat huge meals where we feel so bloated and in our bodies. So generally for women, I always tell my female clients 3 meals a day. It's really great for blood sugar regulation. We're not snacking constantly on carb-rich foods. Just 3 meals a day, especially breakfast in the morning at regular intervals. This also helps with our circadian rhythms to help with our sleep. Meal timing also. So of course when we're fasting, I wrote once before, when we're fasting before a workout, so doing a fasted workout isn't great. We're not getting the right protein intake in. And then if we're not eating after our training, can be really bad as well. So if we put a workout in the middle of our fast, that can be even worse for women. So instead, generally what the science is pointing to is for women to consume about 15 grams of protein, about 30 to 45 minutes before they do their weight training, and about 35 grams or more about 45 minutes or so after their training. So I've been implementing this personally, and I found it really helps with my sleep. I feel like it helps much more with my recovery. Men, they're just not as sensitive to this, so they can do fine with eating around 20 grams for their next meal. They just have so much more flexibility in that way. But for women, especially because it can be harder for us to put on muscle mass, which is really important to get that lean, strong physique. For us to make sure we get that protein in right when our body needs it the most can make a difference. Our next section here on nutritional needs. So there's a lot of conversation around keto. You go into more of that keto state when you're doing prolonged fasting. There are therapeutic benefits, but in general, women do not need to go into keto. We have seen that it can downregulate the thyroid. So there can be therapeutic doses of the keto diet. I have seen some of my female clients do it when they have autoimmune conditions. They're looking to heal their body. They're not pushing their training very much. But if you want to build a strong and fit body, keto is not going to be the best way to do it. So interestingly, I learned this recently, is that a true keto diet, which is very high in fat, very, very high in fat, it's hard to get enough fruits and vegetables in if you're eating such high fat. And what that does is it decreases the diversity in our gut microbiome. So our gut bacteria is not as healthy when we're on keto if we're not able to get that diversity, that fruit, that vegetable. So we need more of that diversity in the plant life. And interestingly, because our gut plays such a strong role in our hormones, that actually getting that diversity is helpful for our hormonal health. So we need to eat our fruit and vegetables and not just eat a bunch of butter all the time, unless of course it's for that really therapeutic purpose, you're working with a doctor or physician. We also can do better with more carbohydrates depending on where we are in our cycle. So in our luteal phase, for example, right before we start bleeding, more carbohydrates during that phase can actually help with recovery. You might have noticed you crave carbohydrates more during that phase of your cycle, so it can actually be helpful to consume more carbs, more sweet potatoes, more fruits, more vegetables, to help with your recovery and to give your body a little bit more of the carbohydrates that it's literally craving. We also see that there are blood sugar sensitivity changes during different phases of the cycle, so that we can try and play with eating carbohydrates a little bit less or a little bit more depending on where we are in our cycle. It's all going to be a little bit different for each woman. So I do feel better when I eat a little bit more carbohydrates and food in my luteal phase, and then once I hit my period, usually then I will eat a little bit less carb. I notice that I'm craving more vegetables and roughage, more fiber. So also just listening to your body can be really helpful, and that there is a difference between listening to your body and just consuming a bunch of sugary, fatty foods and processed foods because you're feeling stressed, right? So we need to make that distinction. But if you tend to notice your body is moving towards, oh, I feel like I need more potatoes right now, for example, or I feel like I need to have more meat, it's always wise to listen to that, right? A little bit about supplements in terms of nutritional needs. So creatine can be really helpful for women. I've been sampling with it. I was recommended it by my partner's sister. She does jiu-jitsu 3 to 4 times a week and lifts weights, and she said it was fantastic for her recovery. Just so you know, if you take creatine, which usually you can do well on 3 to 5 grams a day for women, the scale weight will go up. So if you're weighing yourself regularly, you just want to account for the scale weight might go up. It doesn't mean that you've gained fat. It's just the way that creatine interacts with holding onto water weight. So it doesn't mean that you've gained weight, but just know that the scale will climb up if you're regularly taking that 3 to 5 grams of creatine. That's normal and it's okay. It's not a reason not to take creatine. Vitamin D3 can be really great for women for better recovery, hormonal balance, especially because we're often using so much sunscreen trying to protect our skin from the sun that we might need to supplement with some vitamin D. We see that omega-3 can be really helpful for women, especially if they're going towards perimenopause, postmenopause, since that drop in estrogen means that there is less support with inflammation. Estrogen helps with the inflammatory response. So when we can supplement with some omega-3, we're kind of supplementing in that lost estrogen. Iron deficiency we see in women for obvious reasons. We see more dark circles under the eyes, a lot of fatigue. If women are really, really winded and tired, but they don't really have a reason to be so tired. So always beef is a great option. Beef and leafy greens or some supplementation for iron can also help women sleep better if they're deficient. Personally, the supplements that I've been taking that I have enjoyed recently have been the heart and soil organ supplements. Organ pills were recommended to me by a friend. She said it really helped with her PMS, so I tried the Heart and Soil ones. They have different types depending on what you're looking for. They have some for gut health, they have some for immune system, and they have some for women's health. So I say I'm eating beef uterus and beef fallopian tubes in these organ pills, and also liver and kidney. I believe some heart is in there as well. So I've been taking those. They do not taste like organs. Don't smell them, but they do not taste like organs. So I've been taking the Heart and Soil organ pills. I've been taking a women's multi, to just cover my basis, of vitamin D, a vitamin C. I take some trace minerals, creatine, and then the classic Natural Calm magnesium. I don't personally have kickbacks for recommending any of these. These are just personally what I take, but I got a Natural Calm years and years ago. I want to say 10, 11 years ago. I like that magnesium supplement. And then I started taking the fish oil as well, the omega-3. Let's go into temperature regulation real quick here. So temperature regulation is an interesting conversation because often it's said, oh, women can handle the same things that men can in terms of different temperature. The ice baths are so great. You know, we're still in that trend of the ice baths, when we're really seeing that because of the way that men and women process temperature and heat up or cool down, that the ice baths are just too cold for women. It's just too cold for us. I actually went to a workshop a year or so ago from one of my friends. He's a Marine. He's close friends with Wim Hof, who does the Wim Hof breathing, and Wim Hof brought a lot of the cold exposure work to the States. So I did the ice bath experience because I wanted to have that experience. There was the cold plunge, there was the hot tub there, and there was the ice bath. And it was very sweet. Before we went into the ice bath, we poured all the ice cubes into this bathtub sitting in his backyard. And then we put the ice in and some water, and we'd put in little flowers, beautiful fresh flowers, in the tub, in order to, as Deb Dana, nervous system regulation work, would say, we're putting in glimmers because it sucks being in the ice bath. So you want to focus on those flowers, those little points of relief. And when I went into the ice bath, it was a huge shock to my system. My friend was standing at the end of the tub, and he's coaching me to breathe through this panic as I started to hyperventilate, just standing in a tub of ice. And I felt like I was calm going in, but it is such a shock of temperature change. So I was able to calm myself down. I was able to scoot into the tub. I went into a very calm state, but then it was physically painful. My toes were starting to go numb. Cold hits differently for us, especially ice. So I was free to get out whenever I wanted to, and so I did, and then we warmed up and I was okay. But this research about how women do not handle the ice baths as well as men really hit strong for me based on that personal experience. So the optimal temperature for women in terms of cold exposures, for all the benefits of the recovery, is going to be 55 degrees. So these are typically, in those cold plunges at gyms, are about 55 degrees. These are going to be more appropriate than sitting in a tub of ice. Okay, it's too stressful on us. Interestingly, women can handle high levels of heat usually better than men, so we can be in a very, very hot sauna and survive better than men can. So saunas can work better for us if we're talking about using extreme temperatures in order to help with recovery and the healing process. But we want to at least have 55 degrees if we're going into the cold, but not ice baths, right? Our next piece here on sleep and recovery needs. So our sleep does change throughout our cycle and throughout our life as women because we have these sex hormones interfering with our sleep phases, while men do not. They don't deal with the same sleep challenges throughout their life that we do generally. So perimenopause, obviously we see changes in sleep. Luteal phase, I know from my luteal phase, I'll take 1 milligram of melatonin 7 to 10 days before I'm expected to bleed. So through that luteal phase. And then I get really extra consistent with my magnesium, my Natural Calm at night, my fizzy drink. There's a phrase I use a lot in my work that states, you're only as strong as your recovery. So if we are constantly sleep deprived, we're going through these hormonal changes either through a menstrual cycle or perimenopause, and we're not sleeping, and yet we're trying to train really hard or train at the same level we did when we didn't have sleep issues, we're just not going to be able to recover. We're not actually going to be building ourselves, we're going to be depleting ourselves. That is an extremely important thing to remember, something that I did not pay attention to. Again, we're more sensitive to stressors in some ways than men, especially if we're overtraining and under eating, and then we're also under recovering. It's just a bad storm for our hormones. So we want to make sure that if you are not sleeping enough, then you're adjusting your training to accommodate for that. So in our feminine strength training program, we have strategies to work with that. I just spoke with a client last week about this because she's going through a phase of insomnia right now, and she was trying to do the same amount of training, and we revamped things and had the conversation of we want to be able to adapt the training for, hormonally or stress-induced episodes of insomnia, or I have a sleep-deprived mom in there, and we talk on the front end of, okay, the training is going to look different depending on how your sleep is, and this is what it's going to look like, right? So we need to adapt the training based on your ability to recover from it. That is critical. So I'm going to put in the secret word here for our Feminine Strength program for 10% off our big comprehensive 6-month program. Again, if you collect 8 of these words, we give 10% off. The secret word today is motorcycle. The secret word is motorcycle in this episode. Just write that down, keep it somewhere safe. All right, our next section here on weight training protocols. So like we mentioned earlier, there are more linear male-oriented protocols in terms of weightlifting. Men don't deal with the hormonal, energetic, emotional, physical fluctuations that we do every single month. So they're going to be able to do better on a linear program while we do not. Our energy changes, our body might be more sore during certain parts of the month, we're cramping, we can be more sensitive to stressors during certain times of the month. So men do have to cycle their training intensity. They aren't necessarily completely linear with their training. They do need to cycle it in order to recover and not get a higher injury risk. But it's even more critical for women to make sure that we're waiving the intensity, we're matching our training to our ability to recover. So very similar to our sleep, we want to make sure that we're able to work with our body's unique rhythms, is the way that I put it, in order to maximize our results. And we need to make these shifts a little bit differently than men. So we'll do another episode on weight training protocols specific for women. We'll go into more detail about that. We're not going into that today, but just generally, just know that it is normal and healthy for women to train slightly different than men in terms of how we're fluctuating our intensities based on the fluctuations in our body and how it's acting week from week. So I also want to mention when I say weight training protocols, male-oriented protocols, female-oriented training protocols, I don't mean high-intensity interval training, CrossFit, Orange Theory, these spin class things. I mean strategic progressive overload training. I mean weight training. I mean tracking our reps and our sets and our weights. We're resting between sets. We're not going super, super fast. So I just want to throw that out there. When I'm referring to weight training, I'm referring to like the old school progressive overload training. So the biggest difference, if we could just sum it up in this episode, between how a male-oriented training protocol is and a female-oriented training protocol is that we want to make sure that we can fluctuate the intensity of our training that syncs with our cycle. So then we're training and we're pushing hard on the weeks where we feel really good, which is usually when we're ovulating or follicular phase, and then we're actually backing off and we're doing a little bit less in our luteal phase. So we're getting these nice fluctuations of our output dependent on how we're organically feeling in our body. This is life-changing for some women where they don't feel like they're constantly having to push every week of the month. Their body's not responding well. They feel like they're getting burned out. They feel like they're getting more injuries. If we can match the training intensity to our cycles, we are in business, and also match it to our ability to recover with our sleep. We just fly. So the last section here is on exercise selection. So we're talking about weightlifting, talking about sets, reps, weights, just basic weightlifting, not high intensity interval training. We're running around crazy. So when it comes to exercise selection for these training protocols, men and women actually should have a lot of the same exercises, except that men and women usually have different goals. So men usually want the arms and the guns, right? And women want the buns. So men want the guns, women want the buns. So in terms of exercise selection and training and nutrition in general, very generally, we do train and eat very similarly and recover similarly, but it's these little key differences that make a big difference overall. So male clients, in terms of exercise selection, we might have them doing more heavy overhead pressing, for example, chin-ups. They'll be using heavier loads. Obviously, they have more muscle mass in their upper body by nature. So generally for men, I start them with a 35-pound or 16-kilo kettlebell for upper body. And also for lower body, we'll usually just generally start with a 16-kilo. For female clients, we usually focus a little bit more on hip thrusts. So more of a bridge exercise, hip abduction to work more of the side glutes. We do more core stability, particularly because so many women have had C-sections, pregnancy, pelvic floor dysfunction. And I will typically start a woman with 15-pound kettlebell for upper body and then closer to a 25-pound for lower body because we have less muscle mass and strength on our upper body by nature. So we have a little bit more of a difference between upper and lower. So generally, we're giving a little bit more lower body booty work to women and a little bit more upper body work for men. But other than that, there's really not a huge difference in exercise selection. What I want to point out here, though, is that typically when we think of exercise selection for women versus men is we think, oh, women need to do, like we call them the pump and tone exercises. We need to do super high reps. We need to do 50 tricep kickbacks and 100 band body weight squats. And that's just not necessary. We still need to give a strong enough stimulus in order for us to adapt. So we can't just be doing 100 body weight squats and 50 million tricep kickbacks with a low weight. We need to actually progress in our load in order for us to get better. So we don't stick with the 15 and 25 pounds. We move up to a 16 kilo or 35 pound, for example. So initially, yes, we'd want to stay with a lower weight. So initially in Fem Strength, for example, our program, we do start with band body weight squats just to work on the form, the technique, make sure that everything is really safe, making sure that the feet are functioning properly, the core, the breath, right? So we start slow, we would say, but then we're moving up in load in month 2 and making sure that we're loading appropriately. So in general, though, I'm not talking about doing high rep stuff, but in general, women do seem to do better and they prefer a little bit higher reps, so staying more in the 8 to 12 range, while my male clients, they seem to prefer those heavier ranges, those 5 to 8 rep ranges, but again, they can be interchangeable. Women also benefit highly from doing the lower reps as well, so it's not just that women do higher reps and men do lower reps. What I've tended to notice is that women will feel really uncomfortable or even overwhelmed doing the really heavy loads. They're intimidated by the weights, especially in the beginning of their training journey. So it's nice to start with a little bit of a lower weight and higher reps, that 8 to 12 range. I've noticed women tend to prefer to really feel their movements out. They want to make sure they feel really safe and confident and make sure that they're able to handle their weight. My male clients, I'm usually having to slow them down. They want to just hoist a bunch of weight over their head. So typically they'll be able to get up there much faster, be able to use the higher weights quicker because they feel more confident, they're eager, but generally we make sure that we keep everybody in a safe range and doing what they feel like they're able to do and then progressing slowly and gradually from there. So we covered a lot in this episode. This is a little bit of a longer episode, which I figured it would be. So we covered all different sex differences in the way that we recover, in the way that we train, our nutritional needs, our sleep. So hopefully you're going to take a couple of these nuggets and help yourself out with them, because I wish I had this information 10, 15 years ago when I just started and I was just training and eating like a dude based on male-oriented protocols, based on male research. So remember, I dropped our secret word for the 10% off in Fem Strength somewhere in this episode, so make sure, again, you keep that written down. You can learn more about the Feminine Strength Program at the link rebuildingbody.com/feminine strength. That's rebuildingbody.com/feminine strength. This is where we provide women the ultimate blueprint on how to get a strong, fit body that actually supports our metabolic and hormonal health. We're eating well, we're sleeping well, our body feels good, and we're able to maintain a lean, healthy body for decades to come. I always like to look at this as sustainable work, sustainable work. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you again in the next one. Thanks, guys.